The way you're going to adapt to different websites is using something called responsive web design. Responsive web design is a fairly simple concept. The idea is that you're going to adapt your site to different mobile devices, and one of the key ways of doing that is to respond to the width of the viewport of the web page. So if someone's viewing it on a tablet, they may only have 1024 pixels across, whereas if they're viewing it on a portrait phone, they may only have 480 pixels across. And being able to discern how you're going to display it on these different size devices is key to making your website responsive. Typically, this has been done to degrade the website to fit on these smaller devices. And this notion of gracefully degrading the website is what's often been talked about in responsive web design. So you may decide to hide certain elements or take certain elements like menus and collapse them into maybe a drop-down list instead. For example, this is a website I built called How to Watch. And on the desktop experience or the laptop experience, you're getting a full breadth of the application. You're getting the notion of a navigation on the top. There's a call to action on the top to go ahead and search for some content, and I'm displaying a grid of different results for the user. And this works pretty well. We're showing them a lot of content at once because we know that they have a fairly large screen. But as we go to a smaller version, like a tablet version, you can see here that we've collapsed the menu into just a drop-down button. The button in the upper right-hand corner can show a menu of those options, but we hide those to conserve the real estate. We're also taking that grid of results that we had and we're making it much smaller so we can show about the same amount of information, but the content is smaller. We're hoping that the thumbnail sizes are big enough for most of our users to be able to identify the movie they want to watch. When we get to an even smaller device, like a smartphone, you can see we're truncating this even more. Instead of showing a grid, we're showing a single item wide and then allowing them to scroll up and down, which is a much more natural thing to do on a phone in order to pick the different movies they might want to watch. Again, you can see we're starting to hide different elements of the screen as the screens get smaller. And then finally, on something like a non-smartphone, we're showing just the minimum information. We're still keeping things like the selection and the search bar nice and big so it can be read really well, but we're limiting what we can actually see on the screen. This is a typical responsive web design solution, and that is to degrade this as the screen gets smaller. The way this is done is with CSS. So you have a main CSS that is the desktop version of what you want to build. This is typically how responsive web design is handled. Most of the common design is in this main CSS, and it's designed to work well on a large screen, typically a desktop screen, 1200 pixels or larger, somewhere in that range. And then for each of the different browsers, the exceptions are included inside media queries. So for screens that are 959 or smaller, there's some exceptions done to change font sizes, to change the width of elements, etc. And there's a number of these. So the size of tablet computers in landscape and then tablet portrait are other sections for these media queries. And then finally dealing with the mobile phone sizes as well. And so the idea behind responsive web design is to show everything on the page and then start to hide the elements that aren't necessary. This works through media queries. The key to this are cascading rules because later rules override early rules. The media queries being towards the bottom of the styles that were set, it means that those specific rules override them. So here we can see we might have a main element in our CSS that is 989 pixels wide. But if we see that we're on a screen that is between 768 and 959, we can reduce that width. And because of the nature of CSS, the new rule here overrides. If we had had 3 or 4 different declarations inside of our main rule, we could override only the ones we needed to. And so typically the queries inside these media elements are additive. They're going to override 1 or 2 or 3 of those properties, but not the entire rule itself. This is the way we've been doing responsive design for a few years now, and it works well. We can create these websites that really allow us to generate the right CSS, the right JavaScript, the right HTML in order to adapt to these different pages. But there's still some problems that we have to overcome. One is this subtractive solution means that all the resources are being handed down no matter the type of device. So we're giving it all the CSS. And coincidentally, the devices that are least capable of rendering a lot of CSS are the ones that are having to render the most, because these sections of media queries are additive. So if I'm on a 480 pixel wide screen, I'm getting the main rule, I'm getting the rule for less than 960, I'm getting the rule for less than 768, as well as the rules for 480 or below. So the device that is least capable of doing the computations to get the right CSS are the ones that are being told to handle the most CSS. All the JavaScript for these applications are running, and we're hoping that the JavaScript that's running for elements that have been removed from the DOM or that have been hidden in the DOM aren't going to matter a lot. This means that all the CSS and all the JavaScript is running no matter what we do. There are some workarounds in typical responsive web design to deal with this, but this approach implies that we're going to be doing more work than really is necessary. Images are also an issue here because in many cases, CSS is hiding images from being displayed, but because of the nature of HTML, the images are being loaded anyway. So we need another approach than responsive web design. This new approach is actually one that Bootstrap 3 embraces. Jason Brigsby did an analysis of a number of sites using responsive web design and crunched some numbers to bring home the point that responsive design may not be working the way we want it to. He did some comparisons. And one of the things he noticed was because of the nature of the way responsive design was being done, that 25% of the cases, mobile was in fact larger. 4% they were the same size. And you can kind of walk through the rest of this pie chart. You can see that in most cases, in a majority of the cases, if you include the 37% that only saw a 10% or less savings, that what we were sending down to the mobile views was not achieving the goal of rendering less code. We may have been rendering the right view for these devices, but it didn't mean that they were going to perform well. If you have any set of interactivity, if you weren't just displaying, let's say, news stories, you could really see the impact of this additional memory load, of the slower startup time on websites, those sorts of things, because the typical responsive web design solution really didn't take. There needed to be a better solution.